Today, we'll be talking with Ashish Gadnis. He's the co-founder and CEO of BanQu. And what we're going to be discovering is about the newest EU due diligence regulations and various other compliance requirements that companies are facing. Talk of regulation does imply all sorts of challenges. But let's kick off, first of all. Ashish, welcome to the program. Tell me, top line, who is BanQu?
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. Look, BanQu is a for-profit, for-purpose software as a service company. And our main focus is to enable traceability, transparency, compliance, and equitability in global supply chains when it comes to sourcing your raw materials like coffee, palm, t-shirts, and things like that, all the way to packaging, recycling of glass, paper, and plastic. So that's what we do.
Okay, so look, before we dive into some of the detail, perhaps now it's a good moment. Regulations can mean so many things to so many different people. Let's do a quick overview, if you like, given the narrative you've just explained, of what these regulations and what these challenges are that companies are now facing.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to understand, there's a lot of noise around regulation today, right? So you'll hear the climate disclosures, the IFRS, the ESG sustainability standards, the EU CSDD. It all comes down to a couple of very basic things. Number one is that if you are a company that has a supply chain that is tied to sourcing materials like palm oil, cotton, rubber, and others, or you are a brand or a company that is enabling circular packaging where you're trying to reduce plastic, paper, cardboard in your supply chains, you have to meet these regulations. And when I say you have to meet these regulations, they all come down to a very simple fact that your supply chains that enable these flows have to be compliant at two levels. Number one is at the actual material level. And what the regulations say that if you are sourcing, say, palm oil, then you have to be able to prove that the farm location where the palm fruit came from is deforestation free. And that's important because there's a lot of noise in regulation, as I said, but it's important to understand what it means to your supply chain. Or, for example, if you're a retailer that is claiming to reduce plastic waste in packaging, then the amount of plastic that you're putting out at the retail forefront has to have enough percentage of recycled material. And that is where the regulation matters. Hope that helps.
So Ashish, what you're really saying here is it's not just about sort of saying we've complied. There's now an evidentiary train, if you like, that has to be followed. But look, I've been in business for many, many years. How are you going to, or how are these organizations with this, pretty awesome responsibility of regulations, how are they going to be able to deliver that shareholder value? How are they going to continue to be profitable? It sounds quite an onerous burden.
That's a great question. Look, I think one of the mistakes a lot of companies are making is that they are talking about it, but not doing it, right? And this is kind of where the regulation matters, where you cannot get away with greenwashing anymore. What you actually have to prove, the source of your raw materials. You have to prove that you're actually reducing plastic waste, right? And I think a lot of people, as you said, will think, is this going to be a cost burden? Is this going to be this added, stick that I have to follow? You can look at it two different ways. One is you can look at it as an onerous legislation, or you can look at it in terms of, can I make my supply chain more efficient? Can I make my supply chain more cost effective? Because if I do know where my raw material is coming from, then I have a traceable and transparent supply chain, so I have a better handle on my inventory. So take example, glass. Right now, the cost of making new glass is extremely high because of the energy crisis. There's a war going on, which means you're going to have to bring in more broken glass or recyclable glass to reduce the cost of new glass. If you take a look at the legislation in terms of EPR compliance, which is the extended producer responsibility legislation, if you look at it from a perspective that says, if I bring in more recycled glass, it will reduce the cost of my new glass, then you're on your way towards not only sustainability, but also a profitable supply chain. But if you just claim that we're going to do it and not do it, then it's just greenwashing.
In some senses, many companies have already been declaring, if you like, that their net zero targets are all set in stone. I suppose what the question begs then, you've moved things along. And what you're talking about is moving us along from statements and ambitions. But in reality, Ashish, how can companies respond to these new environmental requirements and, if you like, demonstrate that they are actually achieving, or as you suggest, overachieving?
Look, I think in terms of responding to these new regulations, right, there's a baby step that all companies have to take, which is really understanding their supply chain. And I always use a simple bar of soap, for example, right? If you have a bar of soap in your hand, it is a fully completed bar of soap that most likely has palm oil in it. If you look behind that, there's a factory where the soap was made. Behind that is a palm oil factory where the palm oil fruit was separated and became oil. Before that, there was a cooperative, and before that, there was a smallholder farmer. If you look at that entire supply chain example, that brand that is selling you the soap, the first step they have to do is ask themselves the question, do you actually understand your supply chain all the way to the farmer? Because the new EU regulation says that you have to be able to prove the farm location of where the palm came from. So brands, as a baby step, first thing they have to do is peel the onion and understand what their supply chain is. Second, start uncovering the blind spots in a way that allows them to know who their suppliers are. Are they actually meeting the requirements around the compliance that the EU has mandated? So scope 3, deforestation free, climate, net zero, and things like that, because you can't just claim it, right? You've seen some of the new lawsuits that have come out where brands have claimed net zero, but could never prove it. So I think while it sounds daunting, if you take a 12, 18, 24-month approach, you will be able to peel the onion and then get to the last mile. Because if you don't, either your consumer is going to say, I don't trust your product, or the regulator is going to say, you're not able to prove where this is coming from.
Yeah, that's a very, very credible example of what you've outlined, right from the top end, as you say, to the farmer. But let me put this to you. Even if you get that right, and clearly BanQu know how to do that, what about what happens in some of the places I've visited in the world, where I saw shocking examples of people having their human rights abused? How do we audit the trail that that farm that you pinpointed ticks the box of deforestation, but actually, how do we know the human rights of employees are being protected? Can you help do that?
Absolutely. I think not only can we help do that, we have to, right? Because I think, we live in this climate romance world. And I use that honestly because, we are enamored by the climate romance. And yes, we do need to, reduce the carbon footprint, but you cannot do that by leaving people behind, right? So take an example. You have an iPhone, I have an iPhone. Both of them have a cobalt-powered battery in it. But there's a good chance that behind that battery is a child in the Congo, in DRC, that's being forced into child labor, that is in that mining region being held in child labor. So the responsibility is not only on the materials traceability for phone companies, car companies to say, yes, we are sourcing this reliably and sustainability, but they have to be able to prove the human rights component to that supply chain. And this is how you do it, right? It's very simple. Opening a school in the Congo is not going to solve child labor. The way to protect human rights, as you said, is to ensure that the living income of those farmers, of those artisanal miners, is on par with what the market is. That's number one. Prove that these workers, miners, farmers are actually getting paid for the material that they are sourcing for you. And the way to check that is mobile money, right? We do that in Africa, where you can jump on a plane and go talk to any of the farmers that are using BanQu, and they will be able to show the mobile money M-Pesa deposit on their phone. Because living income is a measure of if children are in child labor or not. And then the third one is the consumer, right? The consumer has to take the responsibility and say to the brand, show me that these communities do not have child labor, and prove it beyond a measure of doubt. That's how we're going to solve it.
let me, if you like, just return to something we briefly touched on, because you've essentially outlined very comprehensively the benefits of, let's call it, as you call it, traceability. And we've touched on the human rights aspect of that very, very neatly. A lot of people are going to see that this is, however, potentially a regulatory burden and therefore will increase. Now, I suspect you're saying traceability can in fact be a smart business move, as you've already outlined. But let me put it to you this. If there is an increase in cost in this, and I struggle to see how there might not be, is the consumer ready to pay that price? Isn't the consumer perhaps happier just wearing the T-shirt, not necessarily picking up the bill?
I think the consumer honestly is paying that price today, right? You walk into a grocery store in London or Brussels, you will notice that you are paying a premium that says sustainable coffee or fair trade or whatever is on that label, right? But have you asked yourself the question, if you trace back that bag of coffee or chocolate that somebody's saying is child labor free or is 100% sustainable, trace it back to the farming families in Guatemala and prove to me that that premium is actually enabling those families to get out of poverty? The answer is there's a good chance you won't, right? So the consumer is already paying the premium. My opinion is if you look at sustainability in a vacuum, that you're going to fall into the pity trap where you're going to create a great brochure, tell the world you're doing something, and you'll never do it. The way to look about sustainability is to look at it from a for-profit, for-purpose lens. So take simple example. If you're purchasing a crop that is originating in Africa, that crop, if it is drier, then it's going to be better for your production. Most companies will lose a certain percentage of the crops they buy because they have no idea where the crop started before it came to their mill, which means that the cost of their crop is higher because they have a loss component. So if you take a sustainability approach, if you take a traceability transparency approach, you will go all the way to the farmer like we've discussed today, and you'll know who the farmers are they getting paid, are their human rights being protected, and most importantly, where is your harvest? It's classic inventory management, right? It's simple and stupid, but it gives the brand this visibility into an inventory supply chain, because there could be another war, there could be another bank crisis, there could be another energy crisis. If you don't know where your source materials are, you're not going to be prepared. This is why I say to people, look, sustainability and traceability transparency go hand in hand, because your inventory will go from just in time to just in case. And we live in a world of just in case. And this is the opportunity the brands have to transform their entire supply chain to become more profitable, but purpose-driven.
People in business, they will be very sensitive to what you've said and listen very carefully to what you've said. But we've been talking about dealing with the here and now, some regulations that are very much here in the face of it. But the rules and the regulations, they're constantly shifting. So how do companies remain compliant even as the requirements remain what is effectively a moving target?
Yes, look, the requirements are going to change and evolve over time, right? And because we're still learning, right? This is a new space. People are suddenly starting to realize the blind spots in their supply chain. There's two ways to go about it. One's, in my opinion, the wrong way, which is every time a new regulation comes out, you put out a fancy brochure, right? This is what's happening in the carbon credits market. You're looking at all the fraud that's happening where everybody comes up and says, I'm going to be net zero or I'm going to be carbon neutral, just to satisfy the regulation headline, but they cannot prove it, right? So that's the wrong way to do it, in my opinion. The way to do it is to rethink your supply chain, rethink your entire operating system, because up until now, brands have taken this top-down approach, which is they're saying, we're going to go from tier 0 to tier 1, and then rely on somebody else to tell us what happens downstream. And every time a regulation happens, they have to scramble. In my opinion, you have to take a bottom-up and top-down approach, which means completely rehauling. It'll take time, but rehauling your supply chain operating system. And by that, I mean, if you look at your supply chain and say, am I sourcing my cobalt or coffee or cacao or cotton? And I want to start at the farmer level. But at the same time, I want to start at my brand level so that we take an approach of inventory management, supply chain compliance, and at the same time, have this ground up approach that gives us visibility at the farm location level. No matter what your new regulation is going to come at you, you will be prepared because you've actually transformed your supply chain from the bottom up.
Listen, very comprehensive. Look, Ashish, I want to bring this to a close. But essentially, we've been talking around many of the challenges businesses are facing. And we've also been talking about the human impact and the possibilities of regulation that is applied and is traceable. Understand that entirely. So I'm listening to this. What do I do? Do I pick up the phone and do I say, I want to speak to Ashish at BanQu?
Oh, man, I would love that, right? I would love everybody to pick up the phone and call me. But I think in all seriousness, I would say the responsibility is with, your chief executive officers, the board now, especially with all the regulatory environment, your chief sustainability officers and chief procurement officers. And the responsibility is simple, right? First and foremost, put yourselves in T0, as I call it, tier 0, which is you. Understand what is your tier 1, then your tier 2, tier 3. Because if you do that, you'll very quickly realize that you do have a significant blind spot past tier 2. Now, you've been relying on spreadsheets and aggregated data, but that's not good enough, right? It's not good enough from a regulatory compliance perspective, but it's also not good enough from a business perspective, right? So my recommendation would be, take the time to map your supply chain. We can obviously help. This is what we do. But if you don't do that exercise, then you're going to fall into the trap of greenwashing. And not only you won't comply, but the next time a new regulation comes along, you're going to be scrambling all over again. So that's where I would start. Start with T0.
Ashish Gadnis, CEO and founder of BanQu. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.